Welcome to Manifest, hosted by international evangelist, teacher, and author Perry Stone. Enjoy unique insight into prophetic and practical truth. It's time to feast on fresh manna, so get ready to be blessed and encouraged. And now, here is your host and teacher, Perry Stone.
We want to welcome each of you watching worldwide the Manifest telecast, and I'm in a new location that we've never taped in before, and I'm always excited when we can take you to a new location and at the same time bring you a message that we believe is real practical for your life. We're in ruins right here, and we have a tier of people directly behind me on top, and you can see them sitting in seats made of stone, cut out of limestone rock, and we have a group at my level, down here at the bottom level, back over here, and they're all sitting there. See, we threatened them to throw them out of Israel if they scratch their nose or they scratch their hair. So they sit so nice, they really do. And so we're in, and I know I use this, and I'm going to minister on the subject of a stadium, but this is kind of an oblong type of structure. And it was used, of course, for the gladiators. It was used, at one time you could use something like this for chariot races. But we're going to talk about the amazing race based on the book of Hebrews. Now, before I begin, let me tell you that the Apostle Paul especially compared the Christian life to three things. Number one, he compared it to a soldier, which is found in Ephesians chapter 6. The second thing he compared the Christian life to was a farmer. And I say Paul. Jesus talked about that in the sower sowing the word and how you had to plant the seed in the ground. And then the Apostle Paul talked about the Christian life being like an athlete running a race in Hebrews chapter 12. And I'm not going to get into the armor and the soldier because we did a teaching on Manifest recently from the studio where we talked about that. We're not going to talk about the planting of the seed or the farming aspect, but what I do want to talk about is I want to talk about this aspect about running a race, because this is the type of structure that the Apostle Paul had in mind when he wrote what I'm about to read to you right now. Hebrews chapter 12, 1 through 2. Wherefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despised the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So he says here that we're supposed to run this race, and we're supposed to lay aside two things. We're lay aside the weight and the sin that doth so easily beset us. Now, the sin could be a sin of the flesh that you struggle with. And I'm not going to go into all the list of sins, but the book of Galatians talks about the sins of the flesh that people encounter. The weight is something that weighs you down and it causes you to be distracted. I'll give you just an example. There are some fleshly habits that are distractions to you. There are some attitudes that you have where you're not actually sinning, but you have an attitude that's incorrect. That could be a weight. Unforgiveness, which is a sin, is also a weight. So these are weights and sins, and you cannot effectively run in the stadium and finish the race the way you should if you're bogged down with sin or you're bogged down with weight. Now, what I want to share with you is something the Holy Spirit gave me many years ago, and He talked to me about bringing it out again for the Manifest telecast. And that is this: that there are 3 times in your race that you will be hit by the enemy. The first will be the beginning of your race. Then you'll be hit somewhere in the middle of your race. Believe this or not, many times people are hit at the conclusion of their race. Now, there's a reason that the enemy hits you at the beginning, the middle, and the end of your life, or the beginning and the middle and the end of your spiritual walk with God. The reason he hits you in the beginning is to try to discourage you. The reason he hits you in the middle is to try to disappoint you. And the reason he hits you in the end is to do something to try to distract you. So the attacks on the race are to discourage you, to disappoint you, and to distract you. So what happens is the weight and sin and the opposition that you encounter while you're trying to finish this race and run this race and finish the good fight of faith and finish at the finish line in the stadium is for these 3 purposes. Now, in the beginning of your race, I'm going to tell you what you're going to deal with. You're going to fight frustrations. In other words, if you're a new believer in Jesus, or maybe you've been saved 2 or 3 years, the one thing the enemy will use against you is he will use all sorts of frustrations that are coming against you by individuals that you used to sin with, that you're no longer connected to, who tried to get back into your life. You will be disappointed sometimes by church people who tell you how to live, but they're not living it themselves. There'll be a lot of frustrations. The second thing that happens is in the middle of your race, if you're not careful, you will fight some kind of a failure. There'll be a prayer that you prayed that you didn't feel was answered. There'll be someone that has cancer in your family and you believe in healing and yet they die. There'll be a child that'll come under an attack, or maybe a baby born a certain way, and you say, why did God allow this to happen? And so in the middle of your race, as you get into the middle of your life with God, and I'll show you an example with Moses in a moment, then what happens is the enemy wants to try to exalt a failure of something that didn't work, a prayer that you prayed that didn't get answered, or a situation in your family that you keep dealing with over and over again that you can't get the victory over. And in your eyes, he says you're failing, you're not successful, your prayers aren't working. Then at the end of your life, and this is real important you understand this, that at the end of your life, what the enemy tries to do is place you into an area of fatigue, mental, spiritual, or emotional fatigue, to where you don't have the strength to finish effectively the way that you should. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 24 through 25, listen to this verse. Do you not know that those who run, let me start over again here. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. So Paul talks about this. He uses the analogy of running the race 9 times in the New Testament. They which run the race, be temperate in all things, etc. Now I'm going to read to you from one of the classic writers who wrote back in the time when there were races that took place in the Roman day. Listen to what he said. Do you wish to gain the prize at the Olympic Games? Consider the requisite preparations and consequences. You must observe and have a strict regimen. You must live off of food that is unpleasant. You must abstain from all delicacies. You must exercise yourself at the prescribed times in heat and in cold. You must drink nothing cool. You must take no wine. So in order to effectively run a race in Paul's day, you had to have a lot of disciplines if you really wanted to get the prize. If you wanted to come in first place, it required what was called discipline. Now, one of the reasons that we're in this kind of oblong-looking building here, and I'm sure our cameraman will get an upper view later that you can see what I'm talking about, is this is the best example I could show you of what it would have been like in Paul's day to have a place where you could actually run a race. Now, we talk about the word stadium in the United States, and we know what it is. It's a sports stadium where predominantly football is played. However, the word stadium from the Old Testament, from Paul's day, comes from the length of the facility, which was 604 feet long total. It was an opening just like you see here. In fact, here's a good example. It had walls all the way around it that were very high, and it had seats that were in tiered levels, just like the folks that you see up here at the top. You see them sitting in seats. They were the witnesses. So this is where all the witnesses sat. Are you listening? You know, some of you know where I'm going already. Because Paul said in Hebrews, when we run the race, we are surrounded by so great a what? Cloud of witnesses. And the cloud is above us. You missed it. The clouds are above us. And so the witnesses are not on our same level. The witnesses are now above us. They're up looking down upon us. And so he uses the analogy there of saints that have gone on to be with the Lord, who are now in heaven looking down at us running this race. Now, let's go to another part of this, which is very interesting. Not only were there seats where witnesses could sit, but back in that day, right in the middle, running directly in the middle of every stadium, was a special area in which several people sat. Number one, there was a man that sat there that had eggs on top of like a rock counter, eggs. And every lap you ran, when you like at the finish, let's look here. The starting line is here, but this is interesting. The starting line is also the finish line. So in other words, you start and you're going to end up running so many laps and you cross the finish line. So what happens is the gentleman would have eggs, and every time you crossed once, he would remove an egg. Every time you crossed the second time, he'd remove an egg. Let's say you had to run 6 laps. There's 6 eggs up there. So he knew once that the individual had ran, he would remove that egg. So there was a person that kept a count of the laps. How many of you know the Bible said it is appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment? Simply meaning that God has the account, the actual count of how long our race is going to last. None of you here can determine how old you're going to live to be, how long God's going to keep you on earth. All of that is determined by and I'll explain this in a minute, the author and the finisher of the faith, who is the Lord Jesus Christ. Now let's look at something else which is interesting. On this long centerpiece that was here, where you had one person using eggs to count the laps that you were running, you would have at the other end the judge. Then you would have somebody who would be in the middle who would have the wreaths. In other words, whatever the prize was, there was someone right in the middle there that had the prize. So when you start looking at all the analogies of this, the way that Paul wrote about it, you have keep your eyes on the prize. How can you keep your eyes on the prize? Because if you're running the race, as Paul would have alluded to years ago in a place like this, while you're running, every time you turn and look a certain direction, you can see the prize. You can see the wreath that they're going to put on your head, which was a great honor. Some of those wreaths were made of gold. And so you could see, here's a couple things you could see. Number one, as you would run, you knew the more you ran, the less laps you would have to take, that you were going to come to the conclusion of your race. Number two, you could always see, this is important, the reward. And as long as you kept your eyes on the reward, it motivated you to continue the race. Number three, you could see the judge at the end who was going to give the reward when the race was over. And this is why Paul wrote in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of the faith. Now, one of the interesting things about the race was what we called the obelisk, or the stone markers that were a part of it. Stone pillars were used to mark property lines in Proverbs 22:28. They were mile markers. There have been mile markers found here in Israel. They were used in columns in temples, but there were also stone pillars that were used to mark the race. So listen to this. This is interesting. You had three pillars that marked different locations. At the beginning was a pillar, in the middle of the stadium was a pillar, and at the other end of the stadium was a pillar. So in other words, isn't this interesting? So you had the stadium area marked while you were running this oblong race. You had it marked at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end, so that as you're running, you could see the marker and know which level you were now on as far as the race and how far you had gone, perhaps even how far you were from completing it. Now, at the beginning of the message, I shared with you how that the enemy will try to hinder you at the beginning of your race, the middle of your race, and toward the conclusion of your race. At the beginning of your race, especially when you come to know the Lord and you find all those scriptures you didn't know that existed and all these promises, your life is very exciting with Him. Then you begin to serve the Lord and get into the things of God. You come into the middle, and here's what happens to a lot of people. That's where they have fought a lot of battles, and sometimes, they become a little bit tired part of the way through, a little bit weary, and if they're not careful, if they don't keep their eyes on the prize, if they don't keep their eyes on the good things that God has planned for them in the future, they'll become very weary and they'll faint in the race. They'll just give up and say, I can't run this anymore. I'm tired and I'm weary. And you do have people, I see this in the United States quite a bit, and I get letters from people where they say, we just feel like we want to give up because we're weary in well-doing. One of the greatest attacks Satan's going to send in the time of the end is a weariness of the flesh and the mind and spirit against God's people who are trying to do the work of God. So, there is a struggle to begin your race, and the enemy wants you to quit before you ever get started. He wants to discourage you before you ever get started in the race. There's a struggle in the middle of your race, and the enemy wants you to quit in the middle. Give up in the middle. Why go through with it? Then the third thing that happens is there's a struggle at the conclusion of your race to try to defeat you. Now, at the beginning of Peter's race, with Christ, you remember that he lost his faith. He denied the Lord and said he did not know Him. But thankfully, he was able to restore his faith and get back into relationship with God. So before he ever became the great preacher on the day of Pentecost, before he ever became the apostle to the Jews, Satan tried to stop him at the beginning of his race. And he wants to try to do that with a lot of you who are new converts in the Lord, to make you quit and give up. But you don't do that, because God had great things planned for the apostle Peter, but he had to maintain, he had to get through that first big lap at the beginning of his race and keep on running and get that second win. Now, the second thing that happens is sometimes in the middle stages of your race, the enemy will come along, and we find that Moses encountered this, that Moses had been 40 years with Pharaoh, he'd been 40 years in the desert with Jethro, and he's got 40 more great years left with the children of Israel, and he gets in the middle of the wilderness, he's dealing with all these people, he's so depressed by them, he just gets depressed and said, man, Moses just gets so depressed, he just thinks, I might as well just die. If God's going to kill them, let God kill me too. That's the way he felt. And so the enemy wanted to try to cause a failure to come in Moses' life where he would quit and give up in the middle. But thankfully, this man knew how to pray. He would go up on the mountain and intercede. And it was intercession. Now, everybody listen to me carefully. In the life of Moses, when he has those 40 years to deal with Israel, can you imagine dealing 40 years with a group of people that they're all going to die in the wilderness? They're all complaining. Every time you turn around, they got something negative to say. And, this would be depressing on any pastor. You understand? The difference between a pastor now and Moses then is Moses can't change churches. Pastors today can at least change churches, or I'm leaving this town and going over here. Moses had no choice. The tabernacle was 33 years in one spot. He was stuck there with those people. But you see, the enemy tried to discourage him, but Moses understood something, that in the middle of his life, when the discouragement came, he had to become an intercessor. He had to learn how to intercede. And as every time the man interceded, God brought a great victory for him. Now here's the third thing, and the third stage is fatigue. David, toward the end of his life especially, I've often said this, that David at Ziklag, he lost his faith. He just said, Saul's going to kill me. Let me go to Ziklag and live. And then with the sin with Bathsheba, he lost the fear of God. But at the end of his life, he lost the fire. The Bible said that he got no heat, and they threw Abishag on his body to try to get the body heat back up. So David went through a process of, at one point he lost his faith, one point he lost his fear of God, and another point he lost the fire that kept his body activated. So as you get older, you have to be careful not to allow the weariness of life and the weariness of the flesh and the works of the flesh to cause you to get so fatigued that you give up because of fatigue. Let me just show you something. This is real important. There's been some things that's happened recently in the United States that to me are very, very sad, where you have individuals that most of their life have built up a reputation, a name, or an integrity of a certain thing, and because of circumstances that surround them, it's caused their name to have a dark mark on it, or it's caused their legacy to be crushed because of circumstances around them. Here's what happened. I want to show you one of the assignments of the enemy, especially if you've been serving the Lord a long time. One of the last assignments of the enemy is, as a person comes to the end of their life with integrity, is to try to somehow destroy the integrity. The last attack on Moses was a railing accusation against him by Satan in Jude verse 9. The last attack against Noah, if you'll read it, was he got drunk and was laying naked in a cave, and his nakedness was exposed to his son in Judges 9:22. The last attack on Gideon, one of the last attacks as Gideon was older, was he took a golden an ephod, took the gold-mounted ephod out, and Israel started worshiping the ephod in Judges 8:27. The last attack against Paul, when Nero burnt Rome down, Paul was blamed for it, and Paul even wrote and said, all of Asia has forsaken me, because apparently the early church believed that Paul was guilty of burning Rome down, which he was not. And the last attack on Jesus, Matthew 26:65, wasn't the crucifixion. That was not the last attack. The last attack against his integrity was, he's a blasphemer. They called him a blasphemer when he was not a blasphemer. So what I want to say to you is simply this, that if you look at what the pattern of the Bible, that we always talk about, we got to start the race strong. But let me tell you something. More than starting the race fast, and I want everybody to hear what I'm about to say, more than starting the race fast, you have to finish strong. Finishing strong is more important than running fast. I'll tell you a little story that's kind of humorous. I want to be careful here. But I remember many, many years ago, we would hear of ministers that would be preaching in America. And, we were having revivals back then that would run 5 weeks, 8 weeks, 11 weeks in length. And they were great revivals. The church would fill up with people. And I'd been preaching for years and years and years. And we would have, again, great meetings. I was very thankful for it. We'd have 400 or 500 saved. Many, many people baptized in the Holy Spirit. But I remember hearing about people coming in having meetings where now they were having 10, 15, 20,000 people coming to their meetings, and people coming from all over the world. And I didn't get jealous, but I questioned God. I said, now, God, this person's just been over here for a year, or they've been preaching 3 years, but I don't understand why they're seeing so many people saved, and I'm limited to a local church, a local town, kind of being stuck here for 5 weeks to 8 weeks. Thank God for what you're doing, but Lord, I'd like to be reaching more people myself. And I had something come to me. I don't say the Lord told me this. It just came in my spirit, though. Perry, you might be running slow like a turtle, and the other person may be like the rabbit. You remember the story they told years ago about the rabbit and the turtle, and said the turtle's got out there and he's gone. The rabbit's got out there and he's already way ahead of you, and you might be the turtle, but God said you're still in the race. He said, don't worry about how slow you're running as long as you're still in the race, because what will happen is you may be running slower than everybody else, but if it's a long race, you have to pace yourself. And while these other people start getting tired and weary and they're taking a break, you've got a good pace. And pretty soon, you're at the head of that thing going. And now we're reaching people all over the world. And sometimes some of the ministries that we mentioned a moment ago aren't reaching near the number of people that they did back in that day. Here's the reason why. Because we stayed in the race. We maintained that walking in the race, that running the race. So in the race, you've got to set the pace. In the race, you've got to keep looking to Jesus. In the race, you've got to keep your eyes on the prize. And if you'll lay aside weight, which are sometimes bondages or habits, and go after that sin and say, God, give me victory over that sin. Because in that day, they ran with loincloths. They didn't run with heavy baggage carrying stuff. That doesn't mean everybody go puts a loincloth on either. But I want to tell you what it means. It means when you lay aside weight, you can run faster, you can run easier. That's why when you see people at the Olympics, they have that little thin tank top and those little thin trunks on, and they got those light shoes on, because the lighter you are, the faster you can run. So lay aside the weight. Now I want to turn to this crowd down here. Are you ready? And I want to ask them something. Is there anybody here that wants to run a race? Well, jump up and let me see you run. Come on, start running. Start running. Come on, let's go. Let's lay aside some weight. I said lay aside some weight. Come on. Come on. Looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of the faith. There they go. Good gracious alive. And there's the witnesses up in the balcony. Our witnesses are up in the balcony right here. Now I want to say something.